Hello, art historians, and welcome to our lecture over Korean and Japanese art. I'm gonna move this over a little bit here. All right, so I kind of wanted to give you guys an idea of how to formulate your notes and the things that you're doing during this particular lecture. And what I want you to really take away from it, especially after we just came off of classical Chinese art, is looking at how we can see Korea and Japan hold on to their own cultures and show that in their art styles, but also how we can see that influence of Chinese belief systems, and that's reflected in the art of Korea and Japan. So that really should be your framing thought as you look through this, is what is still Japanese, what is still Korean, but at the same time, what is influenced from China? Because we really started to talk about how during Tang China, who really expanded China outside of just the empire, we start to see them interact either through force or through chosen adoption through Japan or Korea. Okay, so let's start with establishing just a little bit of context. All right, so I kind of have already done this, but a big part of the story, including Korean and Japanese art, is the fact that, again, during the Tang Dynasty, Japan is going to choose to have contact with China. So with Japan, it's way more of a choice. They actually sent over ambassadors to learn from the Tang court, to kind of learn the things that they were doing, find out what they were missing over on the mainland. With Korea, it's going to be a little bit different because the Koreans were actually in the middle of this massive civil war. And Tang China offered to help assist one of the royal families, the Silla Kingdom, to consolidate power, and that would make Korea a tribute state of Tang China. So through these things, we're going to see a great deal of influence of China on Korea and Japan. And in fact, Japan will get a lot of information about China and a lot of that influence from interacting with Korea itself. So China coming into Korea, we're going to see a large amount of influence of Buddhism. We're also going to see Confucianism go in there, but it's very, very important to understand that Korea had an artistic tradition of their own before China really got involved. So in Korea, they had a great deal of practicing of shamanism and animism. So it's this idea that everything has a spirit, everything is animated, and that you can communicate with those spirits, and that there are shamans who are able to access those spirits, kind of as mediators. And because it's all about nature and kind of communicating with respecting nature and the forces of nature, that's going to fit in really well with when Buddhism comes there. But before that even happens, we have in Korea, we have these early kingdoms that were fighting for power in this area. And the Silla Kingdom is going to be the most powerful one that steps up and gains power basically through the assistance of the Tang, which made Korea kind of a tribute state to China. So before there's really this major influence of Tang China, we have their own kind of belief system that was going to be reflected in their art. So the art prior to the arrival of Tang China is really going to be focused on royalty, which we've seen in other places. Like, it was very highly reflective of status and who could afford to have art made for them and what that reflected. And what we have found in Korea is they had these very large mounds of like wooden coffins, and then basically surrounded by clay and mud with no horizontal entrances. Like, you could not get into these things. So as a result of that, in these burials, we have a great deal of art and that shows the status of these people that was completely undisturbed. And one of the greatest artifacts that we have uncovered, in addition to gold earrings and things like that, and jewelry and girdles and bracelets, is going to be these gold and jade crowns that they possessed. And these gold and jade crowns really were only found with the royalty. So it was kind of showing a super status symbol. And it was kind of believed that these could also connect, in wearing it, it allowed the ruler to connect with the next world. And what's kind of crazy is they have found crowns similar to this in Afghanistan, which may mean that there were nomadic groups, and especially like all the way up even in Siberia, that may have influenced the appearance of these, because some of these crowns have what looks like elk horns on them, which would have been something that only would have been in more northern climates that these Koreans wouldn't have necessarily interacted with unless the nomads were coming through this area. So where we've seen this is right here in the Scythian area. You can kind of see this right here. And this area is where we've seen a great deal of the artwork that kind of looks like what we see in Korea, which may mean that like the nomadic groups would have come through there and influenced the art that we see. So the Silla gold and jade crowns, I can't ever see them doing a written, I could be wrong. I can't ever see them doing a written response on the gold and jade crowns because there really isn't a ton of information about them, but they really are good for an unknown multiple choice on the AP exam. So these crowns usually had a couple different parts to them. So like there was the diadem that sat on the head. There's usually like a spine piece in the middle, and then there's something like either wings or antlers branching out, which they really weird fact, they used to cut the wings off of birds and bury them with people, which may have been kind of this idea of flight into the next world or kind of connecting with the spirits above. We're not really sure. It's just kind of a weird thing that they did. Not weird, weird's wrong, different, all right? So it probably, the best interpretation we have is that the spine was almost like a tree with fruit hanging off of it. And so in the wearing of this, like the royals became kind of shamans that could connect with the next world. And the jade pieces, which of course are very difficult to carve, so that shows high status, were hanging off of it kind of like fruit, and kind of like, you know, the fruit of the empire or fertility. And again, it's some of the ones that have like prongs on it that look like antlers would have had to have come from animals that were nowhere near this area. So we're not 100% sure what the entire purpose is, but that's the best one that we can deduce from this. So one of the things that we're going to see happen as Buddhism comes into Korea is much less burials. So burials are going to be replaced with cremation. So we know that these Silla crowns would have been really before the arrival of Buddhism, but the Tang dynasty of China did help the Silla kingdom establish power there. So that wasn't wrong, but it would take a little bit for Tang to really influence Korea with the ideas like Buddhism. So when Buddhism arrives and Confucianism arrives, it's really going to change the art in Korea. Okay, so this is a really good example of how we can see Korean art adopting the belief system. So Korea basically adopting the belief systems that Tang China supported and then reflecting that in the art. So these are works of art that were actually portraits. So what these portraits would be is of people who were very high status or very esteemed. And these aren't rulers. These are more philosophers and scholars. So instead of the art being made for royalty, instead now it's going to be much more about honoring these educated men who obviously had high status because they're wearing these great silk robes and these black silk hats, which would denote to somebody that this is a person of very high status during the time. And you can see that they have these birds around, like the kimono is actually of these birds, which could have almost like a crest and serve as different reasons or serve as different meanings. But these portraits were ancestral portraits. That was almost like you could pray to the soul of this person by using this portrait as inspiration for that. So kind of like an icon in Christian art, basically. So this is the portrait of Sinsukju. And you can tell if I were writing the AP exam, what I would do is actually use an unknown for this. So I would pull a portrait that would be an unknown, but that you could say, okay, I know that's Korean and I know it's Confucian. And this is how we can see the influence of China on Korea, because we have these elements of this, that this person has crow's feet around his eyes. Like he's aged, he's wise. It's not like Roman verism where it's over the top, but he is wearing that silk hat that somebody of high status could afford because scholars were very esteemed. It's that idea of Confucianism and intelligence and education. So these portraits, all right, so like the portrait of Sinsukju here, show the adoption of Korea taking on Confucianism, because they take on this idea that government officials should be educated. So they kind of establish like a bureaucracy like China had, and they were worthy of ancestor worship. Like they should be remembered as kind of like father figures and leaders and kind of influencers for the people, you know, through their example. And it is that Confucian idea of respecting your elders. And these people, this would have been intended for after their death to be able to pray to them and to like do rituals to like honor the ancestors. So it's kind of similar to like with Buddhist mandalas, where you would actually look at the mandala and that would guide your eye like in circular patterns. Like this would kind of help you in this. And he was a meritorious subject. And what we mean by that is he earned his title. Like he had done something through excellence to his government, through his education, through his service to actually truly deserve this. And there became a canon, like rules for how you show these people in these portraits, like so that you could identify that this is a portrait of somebody very, very important. And here is how we know that. So again, it's kind of like that idea of verism in Rome, but not nearly so much over the top, but definitely accentuating the fact that there are wrinkles around the eyes, and there definitely is kind of the drooping of the face. And this is somebody who has lived a long life and has achieved a great deal during that time. And I'll talk about that later. So the portrait of Sinsukju, Sinsukju was a prime minister, and he had actually been awarded four times this title of meritorious subject, that to his king, he had served greatly because of his education and his wisdom. And he had really worked to bring those Chinese influences into Korea that really helped everything function much better. Now, these were done in hanging scrolls, very similar to what we see with the Travelers Among Mountains and Streams. That was a Chinese art form that kind of gets adopted in, although this is much more colorful, so it's not the black and white Taoist idea necessarily. So there are a canon that you follow, like there are rules specifically that you follow about how you show these meritorious subjects, because it's not supposed to be flashy. They're composed. It could show their wealth and their status, but by looking at it, you would identify what it was, because the symbolism in it was all the same, the hats, the clothing. Now, there was individualism though, because, for example, you have the peacocks right here, not all the same, like they didn't all have the same birds on their kimonos or on their robes. And a peacock has 100 eyes and kind of sees, like on their tails, and kind of sees everything. So this would kind of signify that this is a very high ranking individual. Like that's something that kind of came from Ming China, that like the peacock was like proud as a peacock, like it's a sign of, you know, great prestige. And he was very loyal to the king and respected the king, and therefore people respected him. And it's definitely those Confucian ideas. And you can notice the colors are still very vibrant, and that's because this was an active part of ancestor worship. Like this wasn't just meant to be hung on the wall and looked at. It's kind of like Travelers Among Mountains and Streams. Like it was supposed to be thought about and almost used in worship of, so like Travelers Among Mountains and Streams is almost Taoist in its practice. And this would be, you know, for ancestor worship, you would make sure that it's touched up so that the idea would stay vibrant, just like the paint. Now from Korea, so you can see Korea is located right here, and here's Japan. China is evidently going to really influence Korea, especially through the Tang Dynasty. And then over here, Japan, because Korea is so close, will pick up and adopt a great deal just from having contact with Korea. Now, Japan is going to be a little bit behind everybody else because they are isolated. And going and having contact with Korea and China kind of really showed them just how far behind they were. Now, Japan is very difficult to invade. Even the Mongols couldn't do it. The United States didn't invade Japan. We bombed Japan, but we didn't invade it. It's an island nation. It's very, you know, difficult to get to as you start approaching it. And as a result of this, they do develop a very unique culture, right? But their geography is going to be very important to them, just like other places that are island cultures. One bad storm can cause a huge amount of damage, and only 20% of their land is farmable. Most of it is mountains. So nature is going to be very, very important to Japan long before they have contact with China and Korea. So that's not something that they took from them. That was something that they already possessed, because being on good spirits, literally spirits with nature, was so important to Japan, because an earthquake or a volcano or a typhoon could easily impact them in a very, very negative way. So a time period in Japan that you need to know is going to be the Heian period. And this is considered their classical period. And classical meaning, you know, that kind of establishes their tradition of what they still use based on the belief systems that they adopt. And they're going to adopt a large number of those belief systems from China, or actually through Korea, and also by sending ambassadors to China to kind of learn about what they were doing. So Heian Japan really focuses on the upper class and nobles, because they did have an emperor, but the people in Japan who were really in power were military leaders and aristocrats or nobles who'd always had land in their family, because that's land meant everything in Japan. So really the artistic movement in Japan is a very upper class movement on the parts of the elites who are adopting these ideologies, and really not the people who are just trying to survive. So we're going to see that Japan is going to adopt in Buddhism, some Confucian ideas, some Taoist ideas, and kind of blend that in with a natural religion that they already had that was native to them. They liked the idea of Buddhism that all things will eventually end, because their situation in the world was so precarious, sitting on these islands, that anything could take them out at any second. But they kind of put their own twist on it. So instead of this idea of eventually it will end as a promising thing, like you'll stop going through this cycle and reach nirvana, it was almost this idea of life could end at any time. So we need to appreciate the beauty, and we need to appreciate enjoying this life right now. So they adopt Buddhism, but they don't really get it. It's more about appreciating that life is fleeting and very quick, and it's just a second in time. So they do embrace nature and things like that, but kind of they just don't get it. Like the wealthiest people were the ones adopting Buddhism, and it's like they had these beautiful like gardens, like beautiful, Zen gardens and water gardens and tea houses, and it's like, oh, it's Buddhist and it's contemplative. Yeah, but it's for the rich people, and Buddhism is about not wanting stuff. So Japan something about that trip across the water didn't quite translate well with Buddhism. It's like they were getting it secondhand and kind of put their own spin on it. So Buddhists didn't really give things up. Like they still wore very heavy silk clothing. It wasn't about simplicity. The women would powder their faces and blacken their teeth. I mean, just really weird interpretation of this. But one thing that does remain in Japan, as I mentioned, was a native religion that they had there called Shintoism. And Shintoism, this is how architecture looked. If you look down here at the bottom, this is a Shinto temple before the influence from China arrives. Like they were already very big into nature worship and respecting nature, because nature could take them out at any time. And they believed that there were spirits called kami that were in everything. They were in every material. They were in every natural thing. So early on, Shintoism was all about natural materials in your building, and it was the color of the building and the different types of wood and water that you would use. So it was very into using the nature that was around, all right? And they realized that, some of these things will eventually dissolve, but that's okay. That's natural. So they'll just be renewed and revamped. Like that wasn't something they were opposed to. It was, okay, materials will rot and decay, but that's life. So, and life renews itself. So you can see that Buddhism and this cyclical nature would fit in very well, and Taoism with Shintoism. Just to show you guys like some Shinto shrines that you can still see, because Shintoism is still a very big part of Japanese culture. It's still there. In fact, it's one of the only places in the world that practices Shintoism. So eventually Buddhism is going to come to Japan from Tang China. And the people who, like I said, are going to grab onto it in Japan, which is ironic because in India and China, Buddhism was for the poor people. It appealed to them. It was help and comfort in times of chaos. It was an escape from a caste system in India. Japan, it becomes the hot new thing for like the upper classes and the imperial court, right? It becomes like the emperor's thing, but it also becomes the aristocrats thing. And they have an emperor Shomu, who I consider like he's the Japanese Ashoka. So kind of like in India, where Ashoka made Buddhism this state religion so that he could get the caste system out of the way and people would follow him instead of the caste. He kind of tries to unite the chaos of all these. In Japan, there were all these families, these clans fighting over what little land there was. So he was really hoping that Buddhism would bring spiritual unity and kind of calm everybody down a bit. So in Japan, until Buddhism arrives, there isn't much big architecture like this, and there isn't much figural art where there's figures that you can recognize in it. So in in Japan, architecture is going to rise with Buddhism arriving. So for example, we can see here a Japanese pagoda, and because they have that Shinto background, like natural is much more important. So whereas China was very vibrantly painted, remember the yellow and the red and all the significant colors of the different things, that's not natural. So in Japan, everything is much darker. Like it's the natural colors of the wood and the materials. So you can kind of see here, like China is much more decorative, it's much more painted, it's much more elaborate on their Chinese pagodas, where in Japan, it's much more simple, it's the natural colors, it's not about, it's about the natural element, not the man-made idea of it. So what we're going to look at is the Temple of Todaiji in Nara, Japan. And Nara was kind of the heart of where Buddhism came in. Like it was the basic, big area where this kind of blew up. And it was an aristocratic family there that established this great Eastern temple, all right? And so we have Todaiji Temple. And what this temple shows is Japan adopted Buddhism and therefore the architecture of Chinese Buddhism with it, but they are going to put their own spin on it. So what we end up with in Japan at Todaiji Temple in Nara is literally the biggest wooden building in the world. It is completely natural from top to bottom, which is something that ties back to that Shinto aspect of who they are and embracing nature and very natural materials. And inside of that largest wooden building in the world is the largest Buddha in the world, which they actually took inspiration from the Tang Buddhas in Longmen Caves, because they would have seen those. So they were like, wow, let's create some big Buddhas of our own. But in Japan, it's going to be bronze instead of it being carved into those caves. So we have a reassurance mudra, we have a welcoming mudra. So inside this huge building, we have this massive bronze Buddha. And twice a year on New Year's Day and New Year's Eve, they open the upper doors so people can actually like pray to the Buddha inside from the outside of this. So this is the Temple of Todaiji in Nara, Japan. And what they want you to know for the AP exam is this is that huge cross, combination of cultures here. You can see that this is a wooden temple. It is not painted. It is not elaborate. You don't see all the Chinese dragons and things on it, but it is inspired by the design of the Temple of Supreme Harmony in China, which is their most important building. So this is kind of off of that. And you can see it's got all of these wooden elements, these bamboo elements, like it was very, very naturally made, but not painted, very, very simple. And it reflects the adoption of that Buddhism from China. See, that's in China. That's the Temple of Supreme Harmony, that 2-level building, which really was kind of an inspiration for this. And this here, you've got your big bronze Buddha inside of it, who you can see the light coming from the windows up here that they could open so that the Buddha could kind of look out onto the world and people could pray to the Buddha inside. All right, so let's see if I can get this to play. Nope, not gonna work, sorry. All right, so so we've talked about a couple of different gates, and we definitely talked about the gates to Bayon Temple, all right, in Angkor Wat, all right, and entrances and exits of a building or a temple can be very, very significant, all right. So we have here in Nara, Japan, so by Todaiji Temple, so this is part of it, you can see from this angle just how wooden this is. And if you were to go in the interior and look up, the ceiling is actually open, so it's exposed. And this actually is more of a Song Dynasty, so Song China design, and actually looks like a lot of Song Chinese temples. All right, so we've got Buddhism, which is Chinese. We've got the natural elements, which are Japanese Shintoism. We have Song Chinese architecture instead of Tang, because you'll notice this slopes up a little more. Let's see if I can back up. So whereas this is a little bit more subtle, this really does slope up quite a bit more, and then having that open interior. Now, inside of here is something very important, and this is kind of unique, are what we call the neo-guardian figures, right? Which protect the Buddha. And let me show you what I'm talking about. I just thought this was cute, how natural it is. Like here are these little deer. And you can see Todaiji through the gates if you look past the cute deer. So these are the neo-guardian figures that you can see right here, all right, that are inside the south gate, all right? So here is where this really combines a lot of things. So neo-guardian figures were actually, and I talked about this when I did the Longmen Caves, they were warriors that were Hindu. So Hindu gods were adopted by Buddhists to protect the Buddha. All right. So, and they are, you can see that virism that they're using of very, rippled muscles, very strong, very hostile, very scary. So they brought in a Buddhist temple, which is a Shinto combination in Japan of a Buddhist temple. You have in the entrance, you have these neo guardian figures who are actually Hindu, who were there to protect the Buddha. And that actually fits in with the Japanese samurai culture, because all of these landowners who were fighting over this little bit of land in Japan would like have samurais that they would basically pay to support them. And so this is kind of that warrior culture we can see reflecting there in these neo guardian figures, that Japan would be good with adopting them. And you can see they're really, really big. And their muscles are like, the veins are actually popping out. Like they're meant to be scary and intimidating and hostile. And that top knot on their hair is very much a samurai element that would have been something that, kind of emphasized their strength and, justified their presence here. All right, so Todaiji Temple, one of the things that may have led to, and I'm just going to back up here, one of the reasons they may have needed these Neo Guardian figures is because they kept having this huge problem with, during all of these landlords fighting with each other over what little land there was, and the emperor not having much control, this temple was burnt down a couple of times. So the Neo Guardian figures may have been put in there as a way to symbolically almost protect this thing from being burnt down again during these times of hostility. So what we're going to start to see happen during this Heian period is a period of massive civil war in Japan, when these families realize the emperor is weak and want to kind of become the shogun. All right. So what I mean by that is, in Japan, there was an emperor, but his power was very, very little. And the only reason he had a place is because one of these warring families, or one of these clans with the strongest military, came in and almost basically took the emperor hostage and said, okay, you get to be emperor, but I'm the one who's in charge of the military, so I'm going to say what actually goes, or I can overthrow you. So a shogun was like show your guns, was the one that really had the most military power in Japan. He's the one that could make decisions. All right. So a lot of people are going to fight for this title to kind of take control and establish some kind of order from this. So we start to see under the Kamakura period, all right, there finally becomes Minamoto Yoritamo. He becomes the first shogun. And art kind of shifts away a little bit from that Buddhist idea. And during this time, really kind of focuses on the tales of war to celebrate the victories of this person establishing himself as, a shogun. All right, so I'm going to show you guys the scroll of the burning of Sanyo Palace. All right, I'm going to pause real quick. All right, so I'm going to let you watch this real quick, and you can see the scroll as it would be being unraveled, and kind of keep an idea for one thing that tends to appear over and over again. So see, it's meant to be read from right to left instead of left to right. You can see that cart with the emperor in it continually appearing. And the music kind of helps give you a sense of what's going on. You see the women hiding. See the armor, the advanced armor changing of like, this is definitely a military family coming in. Samurais. Okay, so this is actually a scroll called The Burning of Sanyo Palace. And you can see that it's definitely a narrative telling the story of a major event in Japanese history. And the story that it's actually telling is the shogun overthrowing the emperor and taking this over and, you know, establishing power in Japan and actually burning the palace and killing a great number of people. And some of the scenes are incredibly violent. There's heads on stakes, there's men, women, and children being killed. And we can definitely tell by the armor that they're wearing that this is, you know, definitely one of the landlords and one of the warlords with his samurai army coming in and conquering the palace, and that eventually the cart gets overtaken and the emperor gets killed. So this night attack on the Sanyo Palace, or burning of the Sanyo Palace, was actually done 100 years after this happened to kind of commemorate this event. And what is Chinese about it is it definitely does have that scroll technique where you could do a vertical scroll to kind of tell a story by unrolling it. But Japan had decided that they had had enough from everybody else and was really trying to establish their own identity. Okay, so you can definitely tell this is a little bit different than what you would see in China, because it's not that intellectual scroll painting of like the black and the white monochromatic. There still is the ink in it, but Japan was trying to create their own idea of what art should look like and distance themselves in every single way from China and try to become who they are on their own. So one of the things that's distinct about Japanese scroll painting is it's almost like a bird's eye view looking down instead of you looking at it front on. Like that was supposed to be very different. So like one thing they would do is like the roofs on the buildings, like they had it where this view, it's like almost like they took the walls off the building. Like you could see the women and children kind of hiding inside of it. And then what they would do is have different things to divide the story. So like clouds or like a building would divide the scene to kind of go into these different scenes. And you could almost hear the music changing with it as it went through to kind of denote a different scene. And like you can see right here in the bottom where they've got somebody's head on a spike. Like they've got so much more detail and color in this than you would have seen in China, which is ironic because Japanese architecture is very nature-based, but their paintings had just a lot more color than we see in China. So this is a coup, all right, which is the emperor is taken prisoner and then eventually goes into captivity and his family is killed and the palace is set on fire. And they're very obvious about the fact that they're proud that they took people hostage and put their heads on stakes. But it's told kind of like the column of Trajan, where it's told very cinematically, like showing what's going on. And it really does, it starts out calm and then goes into like this, almost engages you in like a slow burn. Like suddenly it's the dramatic, effect of it, of the scene. You're like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? And you just kind of keep going to the end. And it's actually a really great resource for history in terms of what the warriors wore, what the culture looked like. It's a great historical document as well. And this is what it looks like kind of all spread out. And you can see where they kind of divide the scenes like by the buildings or like the trees or like the appearance of the cart would signify like a new scene. So it's very much a narrative telling that story. So it's so detailed, like I mentioned, that it actually serves as like a work of historical document where we're able to see like what the weaponry looked like, what the homes looked like people who do movies about this time period reference this source because it shows them so much like what the buildings and the weaponry looked like. We can see who different people are, how they trained, what their horses looked like. I mean, it's very, very detailed for such an important, to be reflective of such a very important event. You kind of see here just some of the detail. We're looking down here at the bottom, we're looking into a home and it's like they've removed the roof and the walls so we can see inside what's going on. Just a couple more details for you. Like we can see the horses, we can see the, worried expressions on their faces, and obviously somebody here who met their grisly end. All right. So even though Japan will cut off ties with China and kind of wanted to be very isolated, Buddhism is still going to stay there. And that's because it ties in very, very well already with this idea of Shintoism. And it really kind of helped bring peace to people like the samurai and kind of like ideas of self-discipline. So they really did hold on to that, but they will develop kind of like their own version of it called Zen Buddhism. And in a chaotic place, like if you ever hear, like we think Buddhism, we think like Zen, like very calm. And that's what this was about. It was about trying to find a place of peace and contemplation in times of all this chaos and civil war. So the Japanese monks had actually traveled to China and learned about Buddhism in this way. And then it really became just a huge part of the aristocratic culture because these aristocrats who had these samurais working for them wanted their samurais to embrace this reflective, calming self-meditation kind of thing. So ironically, Buddhism's all about giving up material objects and self-discipline and regulating yourself through meditation. So Zen Buddhism is very big into that meditation point. But again, they almost kind of missed that, like where it's about, okay, but you're still supposed to give up stuff. It's about not wanting. But Japan is all about wanting because everybody wants to get their hands on what little land is available. So that part of the message didn't quite translate. So what we see develop in Japan is something kind of cool. And if you ever go to the botanical gardens, we have one of these in the Japanese section, which is really neat. And it's Ryoanji, which is a rock garden, which means the temple of the dragon at peace. And remember, dragons have to do with like water, not necessarily fire. So think of like the idea of still waters and like how calm would you have to be in order to get the water to stop rippling and set still. So these gardens, all right, these rock gardens were specifically meant for meditation, to be sat and stared at and contemplated. And you could do it from outside or you could do it sitting on like this wooden platform. And this was actually at an aristocratic home. So it was very wealthy, and it kind of doesn't get that idea of, okay, this is supposed to be about not having stuff and these lavish gardens and things like that. So this is Ryoanji is Japan's most famous rock garden, and that's in part because the entire complex itself is so beautiful. So it's got that idea of Shintoism and the natural elements that are there with the meditation of Buddhism, but not necessarily the getting rid of stuff thing, because it's in an aristocrat's home. So like, okay, not quite getting that. So you would see in these a combination of a dry and a wet garden. So the dry gardens are what you would see in these rock gardens or these Zen gardens, which you can actually buy little ones. So the movable features right there, like you can see the sand was meant to represent things like water and the ripples in it, whereas the rocks were meant to be like land and stable forces. So that's kind of that Taoist aspect, that balance of the fact that it can go around it or it can go through it. And so this wall on the background made this almost seem like a painting that you could look at all at once. So here's kind of the catch about these rock gardens. Okay, and this is the plan of this. So you can see that this was an estate. Like this was an aristocratic estate that gets turned into kind of like this Zen place because it was an aristocratic thing. It was like the hot thing at the time. So you would have a wet garden down here at the bottom with a tea house generally, is because the tea ceremony was very important in terms of respect and like ceremony and calming and like comfort in the, specific ways you turn the cup. It's a very beautiful thing. And then you can see here these buildings, which look, you got the 2-level buildings, the Buddhist buildings like you would see in Nara, Japan. And then within one of those is this rock garden. So in this rock garden, there are 15 boulders, all right, and 15 different rocks, but it is designed specifically so that you can never see all of them at the same time. You can only ever see 14, because in order to see all 15, you would have had to reach spiritual enlightenment and be above all of it. So it's kind of that idea of meditating on what you can see and trying to get to the point where you are calm enough and peaceful enough to be able to reach enlightenment and see all of it. And then, of course, you would have the wet garden, all right, which combines Shintoism, Buddhism. It's really this kind of idea of a Buddhist paradise. So basically, these aristocratic estates were designed to look like paradise, all right? So kind of, again, that idea of you're just not quite getting it. Like, it's not about going to a place of paradise where you have all this beauty and stuff. It's about finding a place of peace, all right? So the wet garden was kind of a, aristocratic part of this, whereas the rock garden was the Zen part of this, the really contemplative part of it. But again, it's on an aristocratic home, so it doesn't entirely get the whole idea of this. You can see here, like one of the Shinto, you've got the naturalism in the building. It's designed like a Chinese building, this tea house. It's got the water and the land elements of it, and it's all about, peace and meditation. All right, so we are going to stop there, and we will be picking up with American art.